17th of February 2009. It is 6:14 inches the morning on a small Caribbean island that most people couldn't find on a map. The sun hasn't risen yet. The water is black. The palm trees are perfectly still. But inside a marble-floored office building on the edge of the island's financial district, every light is on. Men in suits are moving fast. Shredders are running. Hard drives are being pulled from computers and smashed against concrete floors. Because 24 hours ago, federal agents arrived at the U.S. mainland offices of a company called Stanford Financial Group. And what they found inside those offices, or more accurately, what they didn't find, would trigger the largest international fraud investigation in Caribbean history. The man who owned this building, this island, and according to Forbes magazine, a personal fortune of $2.2 billion, was gone. His name was Allen Stanford. And for the past 22 years, he had been running the most audacious financial fraud the Western Hemisphere had ever seen. Not from Wall Street, not from London, not from Zurich. From a tiny island with no extradition history, a government he personally owned, and a bank that existed almost entirely on paper. The FBI had investigated him 8 separate times. The SEC had opened formal inquiries going back to 1977. 12 years, 8 investigations, 30,000 victims, $7.2 billion. And every single time he walked. This is the story of how, the untouchable, the boy from nowhere. To understand Allen Stanford, you have to start somewhere that feels completely impossible. Mexia, Texas. Population, 4,000 people. It is 1983. Ronald Reagan is president. Wall Street is booming. And in a small, struggling gym on the edge of a nowhere town, a 33-year-old man named Allen Stanford is watching everything he owns fall apart. The gym is hemorrhaging money, his marriage is fracturing, his credit is destroyed. He has no finance degree, no connections, no family wealth. What he has and what everyone who ever met him would later describe in almost identical terms is presence. A gravitational pull. The kind of charisma that makes you feel, when he looks at you, like you are the most important person in the room. Former clients would later tell investigators, when Allen talked to you about money, you didn't hear the words, you felt the certainty. That certainty, that absolute, unshakable projection of confidence was the only real asset Allen Stanford ever had. And he was about to learn exactly how far it could take him. Stanford's father, James, had run a small insurance company in Texas. It wasn't glamorous work, but it taught Allen something fundamental about money, something that would later become the backbone of a $7 billion empire. He learned that most people don't understand finance. Not really. Not at the level where they can look at a document and immediately identify what's wrong with it. Most people hear a number, a return, a rate, a percentage, and they feel one of two things. Either fear, because the number seems too low, or excitement, because the number seems too high. And the gap between those two feelings, that precise psychological corridor, is where every con artist in history has made their home. Stanford filed for bankruptcy in 1984. But that was just the beginning. Because in the rubble of that bankruptcy, in the financial wreckage of a failed gym and a collapsed credit line, Allen Stanford found something. A plan. Not a business plan, not a legitimate investment strategy. A blueprint for the oldest trick in financial history, refined and polished and modernized for the late 20th century. It was simple, almost insultingly simple. Take money from investors, promise them impossible returns, pay early investors with money from new investors, repeat, scale, never stop. It had a name, though Stanford would never use it. Charles Ponzi had used it in 1920 to steal $20 million in 8 months. Bernie Madoff would eventually use it to steal $65 billion over 40 years. But Allen Stanford, broke, obscure, operating from a flyover town in central Texas, was about to attempt something neither Ponzi nor Madoff ever managed. He was going to move his operation offshore. To a place where American regulators couldn't touch him. To a place where the government wasn't just going to ignore him. To a place where the government was going to work for him. But that was still years away. First, he needed a foundation. In 1985, Allen Stanford left Texas and drove south. He had a few $100,000 borrowed, inherited from his father's collapsed insurance business, and scraped together from investors who believed his pitch about a new financial venture. He drove to Florida, Then he caught a flight to a place he had been studying for months. Antigua. And most importantly, a financial regulatory environment so loose, so underfunded, and so susceptible to outside influence that it might as well have had a welcome sign pointed directly at Allen Stanford. Stanford landed in Antigua with a briefcase, a business plan, and the most dangerous asset any con artist can possess. A story people wanted to believe. He presented himself to Antiguan officials as an American entrepreneur, a visionary who wanted to bring international banking prestige to their island. And in 1986, Allen Stanford received his banking license. Stanford International Bank was open for business. The pitch to customers was elegant in its simplicity. In return, you will receive annual returns of 10, 11, sometimes 15%, guaranteed, every year. Just consistent, reliable, extraordinary returns year after year after year. It was, on its face, mathematically impossible. Stanford was promising double that, with zero risk, every single year. Any trained financial analyst looking at those numbers would feel an immediate, visceral alarm. But Stanford's early clients weren't trained financial analysts. They were small business owners, retirees, Latin American families looking for somewhere safe to store generational wealth outside of volatile local economies. They wanted to believe the numbers. And Allen Stanford, standing in his marble-floored office in Antigua, in his perfectly pressed suit, with his absolute titanium certainty, made believing very, very easy. What happened next would take 20 years to fully unravel. By 1990, just 4 years after opening Stanford International, bank had tens of millions of dollars in deposits. By 1990, hundreds of millions. By 2000, billions. And as the money grew, so did Stanford himself. He acquired a fleet of yachts. He commissioned a private cricket stadium, the Stanford Cricket Ground on Antigua. He built a private airline to shuttle clients between his various properties. He hired lobbyists in Washington, D.C. More lobbyists, court documents would later show, than many Fortune 500 corporations maintained. He wasn't buying influence on one side of the aisle. He was buying immunity across the entire system. But the most important thing, Allen Stanford ever purchased the acquisition that transformed him from a fraudster into something genuinely untouchable, happened in 1999. He loaned the government of Antigua $85 million. $85 million to a sovereign nation whose entire annual GDP was less than $1 billion. Protection. The Antiguan government appointed Stanford's personal lawyer to run the island's financial regulatory authority, the body technically responsible for overseeing Stanford International Bank. The man responsible for regulating Stanford's bank was Stanford's own lawyer, and nobody stopped it. Because by the late 1990s, Allen Stanford wasn't just a banker in Antigua. He was the economic engine of Antigua. The Antiguan prime minister would later say in public, on record, that Stanford was the single most important investor in the history of our nation. And in 2006, the government of Antigua made it official. They gave Allen Stanford a knighthood. He was Sir Allen Stanford, knight, billionaire, philanthropist. A man so embedded in the fabric of a sovereign nation that investigating him meant, in a very real legal sense, investigating a head of state. This is where things get truly dangerous. Because while Stanford was building his island empire, the alarm bells had already started ringing in the United States. In 1997, 12 years before his arrest, a U.S. Treasury analyst named Juan Carlos Zarate flagged Stanford's banking operation in an internal report as a probable money laundering concern. It was filed, and then it disappeared into a bureaucratic drawer somewhere in Washington, D.C. But that was just the beginning of the failures. In 1998, the Securities and Exchange Commission opened its first formal investigation into Stanford Financial Group, the U.S. based parent company of Stanford's Antiguan Bank, and then without filing charges, without issuing warnings, without alerting the public, they closed the investigation. In 2002, second investigation, closed. In 2003, third investigation, closed. Each time, Stanford's lawyers responded to inquiries with carefully constructed documentation, partial disclosures, technical arguments about jurisdiction. Each time, the SEC accepted the documentation and walked away. How did no one see this coming? The answer, as we'll discover, is that someone did see it. Someone saw it very clearly, very early, and spent years screaming into a void. Her name was Julie Proyett. And her story is one of the most infuriating threads in this entire case. Julie Proyett was a senior examiner at the SEC's Fort Worth regional office. In 2002, Proyett's team was assigned to review Stanford Financial Group's U.S. operations. What she found alarmed her immediately. Stanford was selling what were called certificates of deposit, essentially savings products to U.S. investors. The CDs promised guaranteed annual returns of up to 15%, backed by Stanford International Bank in Antigua. But here was the problem. When Proyett's team asked for documentation of the underlying investments, the actual portfolio that was supposedly generating those returns, Stanford's team stonewalled. Proyett wrote a memo, then another, then a formal recommendation, unquote. Her conclusion, stated clearly in internal SEC documents that would later be obtained by Congress, Stanford Financial Group is operating a Ponzi scheme. Her superiors reviewed the memo, and then they overruled her. The reasons given were procedural, jurisdictional, resource-based. But in testimony given years later, a senior SEC official admitted something that Proyett had suspected all along. The SEC's Fort Worth leadership was, in his words, concerned about the difficulty of bringing a case against an offshore entity and worried about the reputational risk of initiating a major case that might not result in a conviction. They were protecting themselves. While 30,000 people were handing their life savings to a man who was spending it on private jets, and Allen Stanford kept building his empire. By 2005, Stanford Financial Group had offices in 136 countries. His top advisors earned extraordinary commissions, sometimes 3% on every dollar deposited, at a time when industry standard was a fraction of that. He gave speeches about the Stanford philosophy, about prudent investing, about long-term vision, about the importance of client trust. But the commissions were extraordinary. The lifestyle was extraordinary. And questioning the machine that was generating all of it felt psychologically, professionally, financially like too great a risk. So they didn't question it. And the machine kept running. In 2008, Stanford reached the absolute peak of his public profile. He announced the Stanford Super Series, a $20 million winner-takes-all cricket tournament, the richest cricket match in the sport's history. He sat in a glass box above the stadium, surrounded by the wives and girlfriends of the English players, watching his tournament unfold on his island, in his stadium, in front of cameras broadcasting to 10 countries. Sir Allen Stanford, billionaire, sports mogul, Caribbean king. Forbes had him listed with a net worth of $2.2 billion. He had political connections spanning 3 continents. Not a single dollar he claimed to have actually existed. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., the clock was running out. The 10th of December 2008. The global financial system is already in freefall. By the following morning, Madoff is arrested, charged with operating a $65 billion Ponzi scheme, the largest financial fraud in American history. The word Ponzi is suddenly on the front page of every newspaper in the world. Because Madoff's arrest doesn't just take down Madoff. It sends a shockwave through every regulatory body in America. Julie Proyett didn't need to ask. She already knew the answer. She had been writing it down for 6 years. This is where everything changes. Proyett's file on Stanford, now 6 years old, having survived 3 separate attempts by her supervisors to formally close it, is pulled from the archive. On January 8, 2009, SEC investigators make contact with Stanford Financial Group's Houston offices. But this time, something is different. This time, the SEC doesn't accept the delay. They send agents. Allen Stanford is in Miami when his lawyers call. And then quietly, without fanfare, he leaves the country. He flies to private contacts in the Eastern Caribbean, then to the British Virgin Islands. He is moving, staying ahead, buying time. But the machine he left behind is already coming apart. February 10, 2009. At 9 a.m. Central Time, SEC agents and FBI investigators enter the Stanford Financial Group headquarters in Houston, Texas. The agents go directly to the executive floor. Stanford's chief financial officer, a man named James Davis, who had been Stanford's college roommate and his closest financial collaborator for over 20 years, is taken into a side office for questioning. Davis, a man who had spent 2 decades helping construct and maintain the largest fraud in Caribbean history, sits down in the chair, looks at the agents across the table, and immediately starts talking. He doesn't ask for a lawyer. He doesn't deny anything. He simply starts explaining. Everything. The investment portfolio that generated those legendary returns? It didn't exist. The $7.2 billion that 30,000 investors across 37 countries believed was being expertly managed in a diversified global portfolio? It was sitting in a handful of accounts being used by Allen Stanford personally. But the overwhelming majority, billions of dollars, had been quietly, systematically looted. Stanford had spent $2 billion on himself, directly, personally. The cricket stadium, the private airline, the lobbyists, the political donations, and hundreds of millions more wired to accounts in Switzerland, Canada, and the United Kingdom that investigators would spend years trying to trace. Shredders are running. Computers are being wiped. In one office, agents arrived to find an employee literally smashing hard drives with a hammer in the parking lot. The people inside Stanford Financial Group who didn't know what was happening are about to find out. And the people who did know are about to face the consequences. But Allen Stanford himself is still gone. February 11th, 2009. The morning after the raid. Every major news network in America is running the Stanford story. Billions missing. FBI raids, Houston offices. 30,000 investors may lose everything. The FBI formally requests Interpol assistance. They issue a federal arrest warrant. Stanford's assets on the island are frozen. His bank is placed into receivership. And the 30,000 people who have money in Stanford International Bank. Your account is frozen. Your funds are unavailable. Please await further communication from the receiver. For most of them, this is the first moment they realize something has gone wrong. Because Stanford International Bank, right up until the day of the raid, was still reporting record returns. The last statement many investors received, dated January 2009, just weeks before the collapse, showed their accounts growing at exactly the rate Stanford had promised. Which meant the fraud hadn't just continued. It had continued right up until the last possible second. The FBI manhunt for Allen Stanford lasts 4 days. Stanford is not, it turns out, in the Cayman Islands. He is in Fredericksburg, Virginia, staying in a house belonging to his girlfriend. On February 17th, exactly 1 week after the Houston raid, FBI agents arrive at the house. He is handcuffed, read his rights, placed in the back of a federal vehicle. Allen Stanford, the man who had spent 22 years making himself untouchable, is arrested in a suburban driveway in Virginia. But the real story, the story that would unfold over the following 3 years in federal court, is not about the arrest. It's about what the arrest reveals. The SEC Inspector General's report, released in April 2010, is one of the most damning government self-examinations in modern financial history. And what it documents, in exhaustive, bureaucratic detail, is this. Between 1997 and 2009, the SEC's Fort Worth regional office received repeated, specific, documented warnings that Allen Stanford was operating a Ponzi scheme. These warnings came from its own examiners, from outside analysts, from former Stanford employees who had left the company and contacted the SEC directly. In one instance, in 2003, a former Stanford financial advisor walked into the SEC's Fort Worth office and told investigators explicitly that Stanford's investment returns were fabricated. He gave them names, dates, specific transaction details. The SEC took his statement and then closed the file. The Inspector General's report identifies 5 separate occasions between 2002 and 2008 when the Fort Worth office had sufficient evidence to recommend formal enforcement action against Stanford. 5 occasions where, by the SEC's own subsequent assessment, charges should have been filed. 5 occasions where they weren't. Senior officials in the Fort Worth office were actively protecting their careers by avoiding a complex, politically sensitive, jurisdictionally complicated case that might not result in a conviction. And in doing so, they protected Allen Stanford for 12 years. While investigators are untangling the financial web, the human cost is beginning to emerge. And it is staggering. The receiver appointed to recover Stanford's assets begins contacting victims. What he finds is something entirely different. Stanford's client base was overwhelmingly ordinary people. Retired teachers in Texas who had rolled their pension funds into Stanford CDs, firefighters in Louisiana who had taken their entire life savings out of low-yield savings accounts because a Stanford advisor had told them they could do better, Venezuelan families, doctors, lawyers. One victim, a retired airline pilot from Houston, had transferred his entire pension into Stanford CDs 18 months before the collapse. He lost everything. Another victim, a woman from Caracas, Venezuela, had deposited the life insurance payout from her husband's death, money she had set aside to fund her children's education. Gone. 30,000 stories like this, across 37 countries. $7.2 billion. Gone. The trial of Allen Stanford begins on January 23, 2012. The trial proceeds. The prosecution's case is methodical, almost overwhelming. They call James Davis, Stanford's former CFO and college roommate, as their star witness. Davis has already pleaded guilty to multiple fraud and obstruction charges. He is cooperating fully in exchange for a reduced sentence. For 3 days on the witness stand, Davis walks the jury through the anatomy of the fraud with devastating precision. He explains how the investment returns were fabricated, how he and Stanford would sit together and simply decide what the returns would be for the year, then backfill the documentation to support those numbers. He explains how client money was tracked in 2 separate sets of books, the ones clients saw and the internal ones that reflected reality. He explains how Stanford had, over the course of 20 years, taken $2 billion of client money for his personal use. Not corporate expenses, not business investments. Personal use. Davis testifies for 3 days. Stanford's defense tries a different approach. His lawyers argue that the investments were real. They argue that Stanford himself had been misled by his own financial managers. If the experts couldn't see it, how was Stanford supposed to know? It is a bold argument. The jury deliberates for 3 days. On March 6, 2012, they return their verdict. Guilty on 13 of 14 counts, including wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, obstruction of justice. The courtroom is quiet for a moment after the foreperson reads the verdict. 30,000 people weren't in that courtroom, but the families of some of them were. Some cried, some embraced. Some simply stared at Allen Stanford, sitting at the defense table, expressionless. He showed no visible reaction. On June 14, 2012, Allen Stanford appears for sentencing before U.S. District Judge David Hittner. Victims are given the opportunity to speak. A retired teacher, a Venezuelan businessman, a widow, a firefighter. Each one speaks for a few minutes about what the loss has meant. Stanford sits and listens. His expression, by accounts of everyone present, remains largely unchanged. Then he sentences Allen Stanford to 110 years in federal prison. The maximum the guidelines allow. Stanford is 62 years old. He will die in prison. Sir Allen Stanford, Knight of Antigua, Forbes billionaire, cricket mogul, champion of Caribbean economic development, is led from the courtroom in handcuffs. He doesn't look back. In the years following the sentencing, the reckoning expands. James Davis receives a 5-year sentence. Julie Proyett, the examiner who spent 6 years being overruled while she was right, receives a whistleblower award from the SEC in 2012. The amount, $1.7 million. The recovery process for Stanford's victims is agonizingly slow. By 2018, 9 years after the fraud collapsed, victims had received approximately $500 million in recovered funds. On a $7.2 billion loss. Less than 7 cents on the dollar. For most victims, that money never came. Allen Stanford is currently 74 years old. He has filed multiple appeals. Every one has been rejected. He will not be released. There is almost nothing left of the empire that Allen Stanford spent 22 years constructing. Almost nothing except the damage, which is very much still there. The real question. Here is the thing about Allen Stanford that doesn't fit neatly into the story of a simple criminal. He didn't do this alone. He couldn't have. Think about what it takes to run a $7 billion fraud for 22 years across 37 countries. You need accountants willing to sign financial statements they know are false. You need lawyers willing to structure an operation designed to evade regulatory oversight. You need financial advisors willing to sell products they have private doubts about because the commissions are extraordinary and asking questions feels dangerous. You need regulators who have been given every tool they need to stop you and who choose, for reasons of career protection and institutional comfort, not to use them. You need a government, an actual sovereign government willing to take your money and shield you from scrutiny in exchange. And you need 30,000 clients who see 15% guaranteed annual returns and choose consciously or unconsciously not to ask how. Because they don't want the answer to ruin the magic. Allen Stanford provided the architecture. But the building was constructed by everyone. There is a concept in financial fraud investigation called willing blindness. It refers to the psychological state in which a person has enough information to know something is wrong but actively avoids seeking the confirmation that would force them to act on it. It is not stupidity. It is not naivety. It is a deliberate, sophisticated, deeply human choice to not know. Because knowing would require doing something. And doing something confronting the advisor, questioning the returns, filing the memo, escalating the investigation carries a cost. The cost of being wrong. The cost of disrupting something comfortable. The cost of being the person who asked the question that nobody wanted asked. Almost everyone connected to Allen Stanford's empire made that choice at some point. The SEC examiners who buried Julie Proyet's memos made it. The Stanford advisors who kept selling CDs they had quiet doubts about made it. The Antiguan regulators who accepted their positions knowing exactly who was paying their salaries made it. Even some victims made it. Investors who noticed, somewhere in the back of their minds, that 15% guaranteed returns were mathematically extraordinary and decided not to look at that thought too closely. Allen Stanford understood willing blindness better than almost anyone alive. He had studied it, refined it, built a $7 billion empire on top of it. And the terrifying, uncomfortable truth, the thing that makes this story more than just the history of one man's greed, is that the conditions that made Stanford possible haven't gone away. The psychological pull of extraordinary returns is the same. The institutional incentives that encourage regulatory inaction are the same. The human preference for comfortable certainty over uncomfortable truth the same. Always the same. In 2008, just months before his arrest, Allen Stanford gave an interview to a financial magazine. He was asked about his philosophy of wealth creation, his secret. He paused. He smiled the smile of a man completely in control of a room. And then he said, "Trust. You build trust and everything else follows." He was right. That's exactly what he built. And exactly what he stole.